So I was asked to kind of come here a little bit and talk about some security. So from just first up from a logistics standpoint, can everybody hear me okay? Yes? If anybody has any questions, I would like this to be kind of interactive. So if folks have questions, you can stop me. I don't need to wait till the end. I hopefully won't lose myself in the process. I don't think that'll be a problem. From agenda standpoint, we'll talk a little bit about some of the specific challenges in automotive. I borrowed some of this from our my colleague here, Mr. Forrester from General Motors. So I changed it a little bit, but he's president or heads the SAE committee for automotive and security. So he had a good presentation.
Security, not insecurity.
Insecurity, yes. I'll give a little bit of talk on sync, which is just from a real-world standpoint, some of the security thinking that went into this particular product, and then end it with a little bit of just discussion about where the industry is, where some of the industry-wide hacking attempts are today, and where some of that may go. So first point, automotive is very challenging. From just a general standpoint, for an automotive product, development is easily 2 to 5 years, so there's very long lead time. So it's not like a typical mobile platform or even an IT project. There's a lot of advanced planning and work that has to go into it. Vehicle programs tend to be on a 3 to 6 year time frame where they get sort of refreshed in sort of stages in that period. Lifetime of a vehicle can be 3 to 5 or more years. And then often we're required sort of by law just to service it for 10 years after that. But obviously folks will have the vehicles on the road potentially much longer. So the point around that is, do we know what our security, what challenges we're going to face for security, what challenges we're going to face for just infrastructure in 20 years? And so from a typical IT standpoint, that's not what you have to look at. But from an automotive standpoint, you have things that are much sort of longer time horizon as far as how long they're going to live, how long they have to be kind of robust and operate the way that they were expected to. The other big challenge about automotive is really people think of an automotive as kind of this collective unit. It isn't. It's really, you can almost think of it as, it's a collection of discrete modules from many vendors with their own views of security, their own architectures, their own sort of view of what they consider intellectual property. So there's often, from an OEM standpoint, it's challenging to get them to open up and kind of answer security questions. And fortunately, in some OEMs even, you get the response back with, what's a threat model? Or why would I want to do any security at all? That just seems like extra overhead that I don't want to pay for. And then it also, as a sort of a subtick, it includes sort of everything that you can imagine, from very low-end 8-bit microcontrollers all the way up to 32-bit ARM processors. Where that becomes interesting is, we tend to think of security, we have traditional cryptography views of the world. Well, if I want to protect against sort of software sort of malfeasance, I'll use one of the NIST standard algorithms like RSA or asymmetric cryptography. On an 8-bit microcontroller, that gets to be a little bit challenging. And so you have to, depending on what the application is, you have to kind of protect for that wide swath, which is why you get some very interesting hacks, and some of the white papers just kind of scratch their head and say, how is it that it's so easy to possibly kind of get into the vehicle systems at this level? And then the final point is, you get some very unique service requirements. And just to expand on that even, you even get some very unique laws that you wouldn't see in other industries. The federal government and the European governments, and I mean governments around the world, tend to regulate automotive, avionics, and those industries much more heavily than you would say an IT industry, certainly like a mobile phone industry at this point. So you get things like right to service laws, mandate that an OEM cannot lock out anybody that would want to service a vehicle for any reason. So basically, not that security by obscurity is a good thing, but just the idea that you would lock certain things out, excuse me, you can't do that. So basically the laws say you have to be able to, a clicker. Which button do I push? Oh, the forward, backwards? Let's see if that works. Oh, Windows is telling me helpfully that, yes, it is there.
Give it a second to install.
Well, we'll give it a second to install and then, oh well. Where were we? Oh, right to repair. So automakers have to provide mechanisms for the for not only our own dealerships, but Pep Boys or Hackers R Us to basically get the tools that are used to reprogram the modules, perform diagnostics, and anything that would be considered sort of service or diagnostics. Does it work? Yay. And the other point is they're often disconnected service scenarios. So you'll have scenarios where you've got 1,000 vehicles sitting in a parking lot somewhere, and service techs have to go basically through and just update them to bring them up to sort of local laws if they're being exported to China or something like that, or there's software updates or service pieces that have to be installed on those. So it definitely makes. I mean, you start from a very interesting security set of constraints that are placed on automotive just from the start of things. The second sort of background piece is most of the automotive networks are based on CAN, which is Control Area Network, which is basically a technology where these group of modules and group of automotive components can communicate with each other. It's as popular to some degree in avionics and some medical device applications as well. But it's heavily used in automotive just because it's very inexpensive. The weight requirements as far as the wiring are there, and it's just historically meets all of the kind of the automotive electrical requirements. So to contemplate kind of how things work in the world of CAN, first we have to shift our mental model from thinking of a networking type protocol to thinking like purely an electrical engineer would. So it's purely based on the concept of signals, and where we lay out a discrepancy. So what we basically did is we basically had a special mode for the module. Basically, on the moving assembly line, it would get the signal from the test station, and it would basically go into the mode, and it would basically start downloading the pieces that it was told to, validate them, and then basically finish sort of customizing itself at the end of the process. We looked at the alternative, which was we just folks probably don't know. There's the big problem in the auto industry in general, where they usually say, "Hey, there's 4 million different ways that you can possibly build this vehicle, and there's no way you can possibly test every single one of them." So that's the classic combinatoric problem, where you've got, I might have a moonroof, or I might have these kind of tires, or I might have this kind of engine paired with this. Quickly, if you're just allowing an arbitrary pairing, you get just a sort of a geometric explosion. And what we found is just with language packs, whether it was Ford or Lincoln or the brand, options like navigation, regional options, you quickly got into several hundred different physical parts that you would have to maintain. So what this really did is let us maintain, from a software quality standpoint, one base part, and then just kind of customize it, the personality of it, as it was going down the assembly line. So that was quite interesting. From a security standpoint, it was very similar to the USB update in terms of the code signing, and then we had some security to basically make sure that it wouldn't get back into this mode even after it left the assembly line and somebody tried to reprogram it or reflash it or make changes within it. Any questions? No? The other sort of interesting topic is around sort of mobile integration, which I thought would be very, very kind of interesting for this group. This is a really hot topic in the automotive and some other communities, as we're finding out right now, just because smartphones, I think a lot of the studies say that they'll at least reach about 50% or greater penetration in the next couple of years. I think, by show of hands, how many folks have a smartphone? And I would actually include BlackBerry, though that's kind of questionable. So yeah. Ooh, nobody here works for RIM, right? No. I have a BlackBerry, so I won't. So yeah, it's easily about half the folks in the room. And so there's been a lot of interest in terms of just, especially Ford's broadband strategy, but I know GM, Toyota, Hyundai, everybody's pretty much looking at it. There's starting to even be some industry consortium work being done in this area, and so ours is AppLink, MirrorLink. So I'll just talk a little bit about the different models. So MirrorLink is the one that's kind of pushed forward by the Connected Car Consortium. Conceptually, you can just think of it, well, not even conceptually, it's literally just running VNC over some data link, whether it's USB or Bluetooth, and then they kind of extend it with some additional sort of parameters. So you're just taking your cell phone's screen, displaying it up on the head unit, and there you go. Of course, automotive companies, the high-end automotive companies, kind of response was, yeah, that's good. We can stop there. Issue is when you get into the U.S., you get, again, this thing called the federal government kind of in your that gets very interested, and they have these things called driver distraction laws. And I make it sound bad, but it is actually just a very good thing. So the intent is absolutely hands on the road, eyes on hands on the wheel. Yeah, hands on the road.
Hands on your smartphone.
Hands on, yeah, you should be texting while you're driving, and then kind of looking down here. No, actually, if you listen to Ray LaHood, that's the bane of all evil, and he's made some very interesting statements about just banning all cell phone use in the car and requiring automakers to just block Bluetooth signals. And then, of course, we get into, there's lots of fun and interesting security questions that you could ask around that about, well, what would I do for denial of service for a passenger, or if there was an emergency, and what if I disabled that device? So yeah, there's a lot of interest from the federal government to basically around just this HMI or human machine interface, and that you're basically not looking away from the driving task. You're not spending too much. You're not looking at your phone. You're not spending too much time looking at a center stack. And so one of the challenges with MirrorLink that kind of a lot of the automakers, I know GM, Chrysler, and Ford have all kind of expressed this issue, is basically you're just mirroring what's on your smartphone display onto the center stack. And Apple, for whatever reason, just doesn't take driver distraction into account, and nor should they really, because it's not the purpose of the device. So you get a disconnect as far as both legal and just kind of functional standpoint. And so they've tried to fix it by forcing the concept of TPM into the smartphone side. So they've asserted that they're going to basically ask smartphone makers to put in a full TPM stack, do full digital certificates from the cell phone to the automotive side and back. They'll do application verification. So it gets very messy very, very quickly. AppLink is based on kind of a different approach. It's based on, there's a set of APIs that we've defined that are very, very limited, kind of very sort of smartphone oriented, and sort of have the assumed rules of driver distraction built into them. And then that sort of library gets built into somebody's smartphone app if they want to integrate with the car. And then basically they can make what amounts to API calls to basically use the voice engine, basically display limited sets of menus, and those menus are restricted as far as how many glances or how many page turns they can do, because you get into some esoteric interpretations of the law, because you're not allowed to go through so many menus in a certain amount of time or within a certain number of glances. Certain logical functions have to be locked out. And then similar, like others, I think Toyota does this, Kia might as well, signature gateway application where basically you, being, say, someone like Pandora or Stitcher, pay the OEM money, and they'll integrate it into their sort of signature application, integrate it into the actual head unit sort of software stack, and then basically you can interact through the back end through that. There's a lot of logistical problems as we see it with that. Just it doesn't scale as well. So each model has different going-in security assumptions. Ours, when we went into it, were basically apps are untrusted, can never be trusted. You can't build a secure smartphone app. Period. Will not happen. For the general masses, obviously, if you're in an enterprise or you work for the government, they're doing there's a lot of work going on to basically do sort of virtualized isolation layers and things like that. But for a general consumer, the smartphone is just basically, you assume it's just filled with malware and just it's completely untrusted. Assumptions about spoofing applications. So we do provide an API with right now partner apps. So the assumption is, yes, somebody could pretend to be Pandora or Stitcher or NPR or something like that, but then they would basically be asserting that they're Pandora. The consumer, first the consumer would notice that, hey, this isn't behaving like Pandora. Second, you have some legal remedies with some of the app stores. Android's a little bit funny. The iOS, Apple tends to be very, hey, if you're not obeying the rules, then you're at our mercy, because this is our walled garden and you're a guest here. So that's kind of the thinking that we put into it. Apps are hosted or directly displayed or activated API. So those are kind of the three models. Any questions on that? I kind of blew through that pretty quickly. I thought it would be kind of an interesting topic for discussion in this forum. Those are the assumptions. And the last point, it's not just about security. And I think that's a big point that was made in a lot of the other discussions. Security doesn't just stand by itself. It often goes hand in hand with whether it's availability, that's the key piece, or reliability, or whatever is critical to the business. Yes?
How malleable are those discussions, are those decisions in the industry?
You mean in terms of the application interface, or the driver distraction piece?
Yes.
Yes, both. So on the mobile app piece, I would say that is still heavily evolving, and there's a lot of debate as to how will this all coalesce, whether it's around standards or, because I think a lot of the OEMs are seeing that, hey, it's a big enough deal that it's not one company is necessarily going to be able to do it all. Right now, each automaker kind of has their own approach, and that's kind of the way it's going. And Miralink is kind of in its own too, because it's primarily a Nokia-led initiative, and Google and Apple have kind of just not been at all interested in coming to the party. So there's some question about how much traction they can get when those guys combined own 70+% of the market, and I'm being very generous. They probably own much more. The other piece on the driver distraction, that's an interesting question. The way it works now is how to state this without sounding kind of flippant. It's somewhat of a gentleman's agreement. So there's general kind of conceptual guidelines and frameworks, and each automaker kind of does some level of interpretation. So at Ford, our legal department has made a lot of just very kind of put some very strong guidelines in place. So things like when you're the task has to be related to driving. You don't want to check, say, your stock quotes while you're driving as much as some people would like to. It cannot be business related. It has to be sort of related to the driving task. The technical agreements don't get into that detail. Fortunately or unfortunately, NHTSA has put out drafts of something more formal and more prescriptive. So they've said things like moving maps on an OEM-sponsored screen should be considered a no-no. It can only update once every 2 seconds, and things like that. And obviously, I don't speak for Ford in this, but or officially speak, but there's a lot of concern because that actually, in some respects, makes it harder to tackle the driver distraction problem. Because I mean, having driven both with a map down here or a paper map, or having had a navigation system here, this is a lot easier and a lot less distracting when it's basically kind of, you can just kind of glance over and it's going to tell you need to turn in 20 feet, or here you've got kind of to glance down, and that's a little more distracting, or a map. But the funny thing is the government doesn't mandate those other two. They can't, without going interagency, they can't demand that these also are kind of regulated. Does that answer your question? Or did you want to elaborate on?
I'm coming from a heads-up viewpoint.
Okay.
I mean, lots of stuff can be learned from aerospace in these regards, both from a driver perspective as well as a security perspective, that are really saying that those statements that you're saying are absolutes at this point really shouldn't be. So
Which ones that are absolutes?
apps are trusted or untrusted.
The only reason I say that is because I would say you don't own the and even in aerospace, you don't own the mobile device that the consumer has, and it's the same with a PC or a mobile device. Though to the aeronautics point, that is a very good point, because they do a lot. When we get back to the CAN discussion, they do a lot where they mix different safety critical pieces. Yeah, they've been doing it for years, and they've got a lot of embedded real-time operating system-based virtualization techniques. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the automotive space is probably going to go there in the next couple of years. To the mobile app discussion, I still think that space is a bit of, I mean, it's not really wild west, but it's still really rapidly evolving, and automakers are struggling a little bit, because you look at Pandora, they roll their code on maybe a week or 2 week basis. Automakers have traditionally rolled their code, and I'm sure avionics is the same, rolled it much more slowly. And so the pace, there's a huge disconnect there. There's a huge safety disconnect. But the assumption here that I put in is, I don't know what you're bringing into the automotive environment. I don't know what's there, so I have to put either some sort of logical separation. I have to put some sort of control point in there to just kind of keep to at least kind of manage the security between those. And I think on avionics, I don't think really mixes just consumer brought-in devices with the core avionics systems that I've ever seen.
In general aviation, that's happening.
In what context I would ask?
In private pilots,
Okay.
they're interfacing into the yoke with these.
Oh, with it.
Flight preparations.
So how would you say that they manage that same kind of level of risk?
Basically are requiring the manufacturer of the piece of software to prove it is safe. It doesn't have, it can be trusted.
So you think the apps, any of these app developers are going to be doing that anytime soon?
Yes.
Ones for the phones?
Yes.
Really?
Even just here in Michigan, where we're meeting as app developers, security is a significant concern for us to sell our products.
The security about allowing leakage of private data or something that is one.
Are we completely out? What do we have?
Yeah,
Couple more minutes? Okay.
something where it can involve somebody's life, safety of life is a completely different level of security.
And I think,
Totally agree.
yeah.
Okay, but if it does, who should decide whether it's valued or appropriate or not? The receiver of the product or the creator of the product?
And the other big point is how big the ecosystem is going to be too. I mean, if you control what the set of apps that you're going to put in there, then there's probably a lot of validity to that. Like if Ford were to basically say, hey, you buy a Ford and you get an iPad and it's locked down and we can basically guarantee that you're going to run, say, this driving app. Not that I would think that that's really a great way to interface with your car.
Who's going to develop that app?
Exactly. Who's going to develop the app?
Problem is, one of the things, you got this huge economy of scale, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an app developer and you're targeting either iOS
Exactly.
or Android, you've got, just like you said, how many millions of devices out there. Now, contrast that with how many vehicles will be sold with this interface, and how much money they could, how much effort they would have to go through versus how much money they could make developing an app that's only going to go in this model, Ford infotainment system.
Exactly. I mean, and we find that, and that's another huge thing. I mean, even just buying commodities in the consumer space from traditional consumer companies, we come and we're like, yes, we're going to buy 1 million units, and they're like, okay, I sold 40 million to Apple just this last quarter. Who cares? And that's exactly what the app makers tend to think. At least for the traditional sort of entertainment apps like Pandora, Stitcher, NPR, et cetera, they're looking at, hey, what can I hit the largest ecosystem with? And it's mostly, a lot of it's been interest from audio streaming companies, just because their data says, hey, you spend a lot of your time in the car, and they're basically trying to hit where folks are spending a good bit of their time, so they see a huge value in it. And that's the challenge, because there's a sort of a crossover point where it isn't worth their while. And
Different scope in aeronautics than automotive. Aeronautics has a
yeah, so I mean, if it were purely safety and if it was a limited ecosystem, I think we could probably do that. The challenge is really around just how big the ecosystem should be for that.
Well, Mike, the other thing too is we're talking a lot about the apps and the integration of that within the systems within the vehicle. But isn't there an evolutionary process going on as a result of distracted driving, that now there's going to be some type of a standard to where vehicles can communicate with each other so that they can avoid collisions with each other? So now you have another opportunity for a security opening where vehicles can.
I was going to avoid that whole discussion, the V2V and DSRC stuff, but
What
yeah.
if human distraction isn't the issue anymore in the vehicle? All right, and that's a good market for people. In other words, you're
Yeah,
regulating
yeah.
traffic
We have a question back here. Sorry.
More a comment than a question about what's going on. Kind of going back to the discussion about trusted apps or untrusted apps.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're getting into things that have the privilege of, getting on the CAN bus and possibly taking control of cars. If there's enough incentive, people are going to figure out, okay, how does this thing decide that an app is trusted or not trusted?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
How can I break that? I mean, I agree with the security model that no app is trusted because, going back to another one of your precepts, which I completely agree with, anything can be hacked given enough motivation, enough time, they're going to hack the trust mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, completely agree. But I'm trying to think I was going to make a follow-up comment to that, but I forgot what I was going to say. So we talked a little bit about the University of Washington papers, so we can kind of skip through this. There were some TPMS hacks, which is tire pressure monitor sensor. It was mostly theoretical stuff, and I've got to kind of wrap it up a little bit. So where technology is going, it's where the PC industry was 15 years ago, democratization. So, I was going to mention, so yeah, distracted driving. What's interesting is you go to China, they don't care. They don't care at all. It's like, display the video on the screen, and we want to watch TV while we're going down the road. So you get a different viewpoint even as you go into different markets. And their philosophy is, hey, I don't care about safety glass. I want a nice big screen in my dashboard. South America, you get some examples of that too, where they want the big screen and they don't care about sort of what we would consider to be just stuff like airbags and stuff that you would consider to be key to the vehicle. Yes?
So forward thinking, how does this also tie into electric vehicles and Zigbee?
So electric vehicles, can you be a little more specific? You mean like how?
So Zigbee's yet one other interface, right, that's being looked at so that vehicles tie into home energy monitoring systems and charging stations, and are you dealing with any of those things?
We haven't done a whole lot with Zigbee at this point. It's just a question of how big the ecosystem is. So I can speak, I'm trying to refresh how much of this is, I think most of it is public, and we've did a CES, or our CEO did a CES presentation about a year ago on it, a keynote. So right now the way it works is there is an embedded modem, and basically it uses that to communicate back to sort of cloud-based services that have the smart grid information to help kind of optimize the charging. The big deal around that is if you can charge during certain times of the day, you can get a much lower rate, and so you can make the economies for the either the hybrid or the battery electric much more appealing. So that's kind of how it's working now, just because it is a very small ecosystem for the hybrid vehicles for everybody. As it grows, assuming it grows, I mean, and how big it grows, it could take off. It's just a question of where it's going to go. Right now, electric vehicles tend to be more popular with fleet customers because they can get the ROI much more quickly. I think I've got I'm almost done actually. So security's getting a lot more detail. I think anyone's failure gives everyone a black eye. There's a lot of work in SAE going on right now. To the black eye comment was when the University of Washington paper came out. Even though it wasn't Ford, the press folks that our PR lead talked to, the attitude was very much every OEM is guilty until proven innocent. So it's interesting. Security, even if you don't get hacked, you still, I would say you don't get mileage out of it. But you still everybody gets a black eye. So even though it wasn't ours, and you can kind of go, phew, but it's still, hey, from the larger sort of consumer public vantage point, everybody is kind of suspect now that this has become possible. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of desire to kind of work across OEM and supplier lines to kind of work through the problem, which is very good news. And so that's what I've got. Any other questions? I know we're kind of pushing the boundary on the time. Nope. Okay. Thank you.